Hello, thank you for joining the 2024 Smithsonian National Education Summit. My name is Dr. Roshni Lal, and I am the Director of the Office of Academic Appointments and Internships with the Smithsonian Institution. I oversee the central office that manages and facilitates thousands of internships and fellowships throughout the Smithsonian's museums, zoo, and research facilities globally. Today, we are joined by three invited guests representing the National Council of Teachers of English. The National Council of Teachers of English is a not-for-profit professional association of educators dedicated to improving the teaching and learning of English and the language arts at all levels of education. In this session, the panel will share strategies from the Digital Democratic Dialogue, or 3D project, which harnesses digital media platforms to support students from geographically, demographically, and ideologically distinct communities across the country, so that they can share their civic stories, understand perspectives different from their own, and discuss controversial issues from a stance of critical civic empathy. Representing the National Council of Teachers of English, please help me welcome NCTE's Executive Director, Emily Kirkpatrick, who is joined by Nicole Mira and Dr. Katie Wolf.
Thank you so much. We are so grateful to be here. We're excited to talk to you about particularly the power of digital media, which we know in this moment can have both extremely positive and extremely negative effects on society, and talk a little bit about the way with the guidance of NCTE, we've been able to develop a project that harnesses the power of youth ingenuity and creativity, along with classroom English language arts instruction through the power of digital media platforms. And so if we could have our slides brought up, please. And I'll get started as we're waiting for that to come up. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm currently a teacher educator and a professor at Rutgers University. But before that, I was a high school English teacher myself. And like many of the folks that I teach and many of my colleagues and friends that are in K-12 education right now, and all of you that are watching, we know that the range of different ways that we are being kind of overwhelmed and inundated with digital media can seem a little bit hard to navigate as a teacher. Anything from the language around 21st century skills to critical media literacy skills, generative AI, the learning management systems that we deal with, digital citizenship education. We feel like digital media is all around us, but somehow it's still kind of hard to get our hands on about exactly how, in the course of our everyday work, we should be using digital media in the classroom. I was trying to think about this as I was thinking about a project that I could do with other educators and with young people, because young people are also coming to us often with the narrative in society that they already know how to use these tools and they are fluent in them, when in fact they are learning just as we are. And so what does it mean in the classroom, particularly for English language arts teachers who are so invested in literacy in all of its forms, to think about the purposes of what it can be used for in terms of our civic life. If we could move to the next slide. And as any of us know, and as we talk to young teachers and to young people across the country, we are struggling as a society. Young people are struggling. Anyone that teaches young people, anyone that loves young people, knows that this is a very difficult time. And we know that data is starting to bear this out, not only because of the pandemic, but the pandemic has totally opened up this very large chasm in terms of engagement, in terms of attendance, in terms of young people's mental health and mental wellness. We know viscerally that the world that we are living in is not the same world that we were living in pre-pandemic, or even just last week. Things are changing so quickly. Many of you may have seen that the Surgeon General has been calling for a warning label on social media platforms. We've got school districts, including LAUSD, seeking to ban cell phone use in the classroom. So digital media is becoming a flashpoint as we are thinking about what it means to educate young people for the turbulent democratic world that we are living in, and what role it should play. It's very tempting, because of the negative effects that social media definitely can have, to kind of close it out of our classroom spaces. But as any teacher knows, and as any parent knows, and as anyone that loves children knows, it's not that simple. And we're trying to figure out ways to integrate technologies in ways that bring out the best of it while mitigating and helping young people to understand the negative effects that can have. And that was kind of the genesis of this project. What would happen if we got young people together, classroom teachers together, university folks together, and professional organizations together to talk critically about what the possibilities of social media could be, rather than turning it away from our classrooms. If you could move to the next slide. And when we thought about that, we know all the things that social media can do in society and in democracy that is negative. We know about the dangerous effects of misinformation and disinformation. We know that social media echo chambers can make it harder for us to talk to each other rather than easier. We know that in our current political climate, young people's mental health is suffering based on things that can happen on the internet. But we also have to remember, and this is a session about art, right? The theme of the session that we're in is around art, and there is an art to digital media. And one of the things that digital media can do on a scale that is more powerful than many other tools that we have available to us is that it can connect people across time and space in unique ways. What would it mean for us to take full advantage of the connections and the empathy that can possibly happen when people from dissimilar places in life, dissimilar ideologies, dissimilar demographics? What could happen if we use that very powerful tool of digital media for the purposes of connection and empathy, rather than for disconnection and division? That was the genesis of, again, trying to figure out a way within the school year, within the school day, kind of speaking back to some of the very binary language and thinking that often happens in education. Let's work with real teachers and real young people to think about a different way forward. Next, please. That was the genesis of this project, which is the Digital Democratic Dialogue, or 3D project. This project started back in 2018 with 6 different teachers from, as we said, communities across the United States through the National Writing Project Network. And the idea, and you're going to learn more about the details, I know we've got lots of classroom folks here and administrators who may be interested in the day-to-day details. So we're going to go into how we actually structured this project. But the overall idea was that it was a space to bring together through digital media platforms, young people living in very different communities, along with their English teachers, because again, we want to challenge the idea that civics takes place only in one classroom, only in a social studies classroom. Instead, thinking about civic learning writ large as a purpose for all of us. How could we celebrate civic literacy skills through online platforms and get young people to actually see how their experiences are similar to and different from others around the country? And so before I go into more of the details, I want to give you a little glimpse of what this project actually feels like from the inside by turning it over to one of our teachers that has been participating, and that's Dr. Katie Wolf.
Thank you, Nicole. You can move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to introduce myself really quickly. First, to start off, I am an English teacher. I actually serve on the Makah Reservation, which is in Washington State. And we are a public school, so state-funded school and land, but we're completely surrounded by the Makah Reservation. So 100% of my students are Native American. Not all are Makah, maybe 80, somewhere in the 80% range, 80 to 85% range are Makah. And this area that I live in is extremely rural. We are an hour and a half from the nearest grocery store, just to kind of give you an idea of, where my students are coming from. So the industries out here, most of my students are commercial fishermen or come from a commercial fishing family. We deal with a lot of issues, technology issues like power outages and, internet connectivity issues, cell phone issues, out here just because of our location. And on the slide that you see, I included some pictures of my students and where we live, so you can, again, have an idea of what that looks like for us. So I have been teaching for 15 years, and I saw this opportunity come up on a newsletter from NCTE to apply for this opportunity. And for me, being a teacher for a while in the classroom, then trying to figure out how to incorporate digital technologies and social media into the existing standards for our state has been something that has been kind of like really cogent for me. Because, there's this big focus on, we still need to have very literate students and, but we also need to prepare them for the jobs that they're going to have in the future, which our jobs in the future, as we all know, right, are very based on technology. Being able to navigate kind of the digital world, but also, with that idea that as the United States continues to become more divided, how can we kind of bring people together, right? And how can we, continue to try to foster conversations so that we stop, right, the division and, kind of pull together. And I think that all it's a heavy weight, for English teachers, for sure, on our shoulders as we, go to think about how are we preparing our students to participate and communicate in, our society. We can move on to the next slide. So when we started this project, then, we started it, and I know Nicole will go into this a little bit later, but our very first, kind of project where the kids got to be able to, see other kids work and, talk to other kids was just a basic introduction. And the kids could introduce themselves any way that they wanted to. They could use, any platform that they wanted to, whether it was just a written paragraph of introduction, all the way to maybe using AI to create a comic strip, all the way, to doing a podcast or a video. And we had a wide range of those. And then the students got together in groups. We put them into small groups, and they just got to see each other's introductions. And so after that introduction stage, then the students got to start to talk to each other. So we allowed them to, or we encouraged them to, comment on each other's introductions and make connections with each other. And, I included on this slide some of what, my students said directly from their mouths. And I think the biggest overall impression, my students are very homogenous with each other. Most of them are Makah, all of them are Native American. And so, they come from a very specific perspective. And so, and really life experience, living on the res. We have a lot of students who, don't really go beyond reservation life. They might travel from reservation to reservation to go visit family. But, the travel and, going elsewhere and seeing other places and other people, it's not as common for my students. And so, having them just to see that kids are kind of the same everywhere was a huge eye-opening experience, I think, for them, because that was the biggest thing. The day-to-day conversation from them was, these kids are really nice, or, I think that, there's a lot of similarities, right, that we have, with these other kids, like, oh, basketball is so popular over in this school and it's popular here too. And I think that that's really interesting because they're 2,000 miles away from me. And so, it was just a very positive interaction, and it spurred more conversation in my classroom. So when we were not maybe commenting or, working on our 3D projects, it inspired, kind of more research and more conversation about different places in the United States, which, again, for my students specifically was really, I think it was really an area that had potential for, huge growth. We can move on to the next slide. So some of the things that my students learned here in doing this project was digital media platforms. I mean, just being able to utilize some of those digital media tools, because I don't, I had to teach the kids before I could ask them to do something. I had to teach them how to do it. So, how to use AI to create a comic strip. We had to do, a lesson on that, how to use it, how to make a podcast and actually edit a podcast. We had to do multiple lessons on that, how to create a video. So this, project not only allowed them, right, to create those things and talk to each other, in that creative way, but it also allowed them to learn those technologies and learn, those skills that Nicole said, that when kids are coming in college, they think they might know how to do it, but they really, they're not as comfortable maybe using it unless they've done it before. And so that opportunity to be able to, teach the kids specifically, okay, you're going to learn how to do this, and now you get to share it, has been really powerful. My students also learned that taking risks within technology can be really something that's okay and that's safe. So, taking a risk to make a project is something I think that a lot of teenagers struggle with. If again, it's out of sight of their comfort zone. And so, they may not feel comfortable doing it, but having this opportunity and seeing that there were a whole bunch of other students from all over taking the same risks was, again, a really powerful place for for learning. And again, I know Nicole already talked about this, but that communication and empathy piece was a huge thing for my students to really think about, in that talking to students from other schools and seeing them. We actually got an opportunity to see each other on Zoom. And so seeing them live and you know, listening to them speak, I think was just this huge you know, this learning pathway, right, for being able to communicate and being able to see other people from different walks of life as real people and as like real stories, and that, you know, everyone is more similar than we are different. And so I think that now I'm going to pass it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Katie. And we can move to the next slide. I wanted to put this slide up here just to show everyone. Sometimes there's this idea of this large project that involves teachers from all over the country. It sounds like it's very sophisticated. At the end of the day, it's a Zoom meeting is where a lot of this is born, right? So this is all of us. These are all of the teachers that were part of this year's cohort, as well as teachers who are from a previous cohort. Like I said, we started this back in 2018, and the 3D project has really become a teacher family once you're part of the project. As Katie was going to find out, you never leave, ever. So once everyone is in our family, we continue to build as professionals. And we found through this project, like many of you may be wondering, well, what exactly are the platforms that you use? Or how do you move from talking, how do they share work with each other? Do you move forward to talking about controversial issues? Yes, we do. But one thing that's very interesting, as all teachers know, is that we have to be ingenious and we have to work with what we have. There's no one social media platform or any digital platform out there that really allows this collaboration to happen organically. We really had to work through different tools to build this. But what we did is we came together and we said, well, what would we dream that our young people could do with each other? And that is the core of this that I want everyone to be able to take away. And we're excited to have more folks reach out to hear about the growth of the 3D project over in time into the future alongside NCTE. But really, this was about people coming together. We dreamed up what we wanted a school year to look like. So all of the teachers that are involved, we had monthly meetings on Zoom. We had a back channel that we would constantly be chatting with. We were emailing all the time, and we used various social media and digital tools to then turnkey that back to our classrooms so that young people could then engage in different, what we call design cycles. So we can move to the next slide. Just to give you an idea of what this looked like, all of us met, the first time this happened, we met during the summer before the school year, and then the school year got started. And we moved through 3 different design cycles and then met over the summer for a retreat afterwards. And it's kind of a year-long program. With this most recent cohort, we started a little bit later, and now that we're continuing into a second year together. So it's really not a project that ever ends, because the project of civic dialogue doesn't end. We're just figuring out how to add and incorporate more and more students into this project. What you see on your screen, also this picture, this is a very high tech, for a digital media project. This is a very high tech, low tech series of pieces of chart paper where we did a lot of our data analysis together. This is where, when we first came together as a group of teachers and educators, we said to ourselves, what does civics mean to us? Sometimes when we get our students to talk directly about controversial civic issues that are very heavy, if we don't do the prep work of them getting to know the people they're talking to or to feel cared for in that discussion, it's very difficult to get the conversation off the ground, or it stays in the realm of political talking points. So we actually decided civics should actually rewind. It should first be about, like, who are we together? Why should we care about each other? So we designed together, these are 3 ideas for design cycles that all of our teachers together have collaboratively designed. We said that all civic conversation first needs to start with this idea of asking, who are you? Describe the way your world is and the way you want it to be. So we start from a very low threshold that, like Katie said, is really about young people getting to just know each other as human beings. Young people are connected all the time through digital media, but we found through this project that they often feel very alone. And so it's a contradiction in terms, but it's because adults do have a role to play still. We have a very powerful place in our classrooms to facilitate meaningful connection that is much deeper than what often happens on TikTok or on different social media platforms. Only once the students get to know each other in all of their silliness and sharing anything about their lives that they care to, only then do we turn to a little bit deeper into the issues that matter to them. And that's after a whole semester. So we often spend the entire fall just playing with kids, chatting about the things they care about, music, sports, whatever it is. Only when they know each other do we then turn it to what does matter to you. And we find that young people, just like adults, are interested in the same range of civic issues, the same level of complexity. They have things that they desire, they have lived experiences, and they have things that they imagine that they want for their civic futures. And we use that as the basis of empathetic and creative conversation. And we always end the school year by thinking about the future, right? So civics is not only about the structures that we have in place currently, it's also about the futures and how we hope to live together in the future. We know that like the changes that young people have seen in their lifetimes are things that we could not have dreamt of ourselves. And so we need to prepare young people for more things that we could not yet dream of. And that's kind of the process we go through. And I know we're gonna have some time at the end for some Q&A. So if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to put those in there about how we put this together, and we're happy to talk more about that. We can move to the next slide. So as Katie said, the very first design cycle of we decided to use, again, because it was very difficult to find a protected platform. We know that educators also have very real concerns around privacy of students' data. So we were not using public facing platforms. We created actually a Google Classroom, which is another, it's a little bit of a schooled platform, and we kind of didn't want to use a school platform to do a non-school and kind of hybrid school project. But we had to kind of, again, make do with tools, and we created a separate Google Classroom where all the students were able to safely log in with the permission of the school districts and permission of their parents. And they shared anything they wanted to make to answer that first design cycle question of who are you, what is the world you live in, and what is the world you dream of. Some students did create comic strips. Another student here just created kind of like a PowerPoint slide with different images. And they posted these into groups. We actually had about, across the 6 sites this year, we had close to 200 students from across the 6 sites. We split them up into smaller groups so that it wouldn't be too overwhelming, but they were able to meet in cross school groups to share their multimodal stories of who they were, and then to engage in live chat, a moderated chat, obviously, that we were always present for, so that they could get to know each other. The conversations, went into what teenagers talk about. They were asking what the weather was like where they live. They were asking about what they had available to eat. They were talking about the things, their dreams, and very quickly the conversation turned into really vulnerable and really beautiful sharing. So it feels sometimes like we should skip over this part. It feels like if we want to talk about civic dialogue, we immediately have to move into that very scripted, argumentative, let's talk about the real issues, let's gain evidence, let's move into that. But we found that over and over again, young people first need to feel just a sense of connection and a sense that they are seen as individuals, and understanding that the United States is a very big place, and that yes, they are very similar, but they could also celebrate their differences and realize that folks live lives that are different from them. And that's okay, right? And that leads to much deeper thinking about what kind of world they want to live in, and how to argue for the points that they care most about. Next slide, please. Only then do we move into more focused conversation about issues. This is actually from the first iteration of the 3D project that happened several years ago, but we asked students after they got to know each other to tell us one issue that they really wanted to delve a little bit further into with their peers. What's something that you want to talk about? And the list of things that they wanted to talk about could be the same list that I could pull from a public interest survey of voters right now. And not surprisingly, and very sadly, the number one issue that many young people across all the sites across the country wanted to talk about is guns, the effects of guns in our life, right? We then put students into cross groups, and even with all the care that we put in to creating the sense of vulnerability and the sense of community, when we first put students into discussion groups and said, again, your point is not to persuade anyone of your issue, your point is just to talk a little bit about what this issue means in your life. You can see here, students that we often as English teachers can be so used to socializing young people into this idea of debates and arguments about civic life, that students, when they went into their groups, immediately said, hello, I'm here for the debate. Because we often teach that that's what civic dialogue means. They see that on cable news, they see that around them. And students started to kind of toss talking points at each other. Because again, we teach young people in our classes to harness evidence, make claims, make counterclaims, which is all important. But if we haven't set the larger frame, it winds up kind of becoming a ping pong battle. And what we found when we first started opening up the discussion groups is that they weren't truly listening to each other the way they were when they were talking about themselves. Something about this idea of civics kind of gets us all a little bit frightened, and we start to get formal, and we stop that vulnerable sharing, and we think that we're just supposed to kind of share evidence about, I'm pro-guns, I'm anti-guns, this is what, and so we actually paused together as a community of adults And even we brought the young people into it too. We had the young people look at the discussion threads, and everyone said, we're not feeling like this is getting where we want to go. We feel like we're not truly connecting anymore. And so what we did again is went back to the idea of multimodal storytelling. And if we can go to the next slide, we asked students to instead think about, what does this issue mean in your life? Stop trying to convince, stop trying to bring in talking points. Let's pause for a second. You chose to be in this group to talk about this particular issue. What is your experience with this issue? And at first glance, the two images that you see on the screen might look like it's another debate, but this actually opened up a much richer and empathetic dialogue. This image on the left is from a student that lived in a rural community in Northern California, in which guns were a tool in everyday life. And they took a picture of their front porch to kind of share that image. Whereas a student that was living in an urban community in Pennsylvania had a very different experience with guns and posted a picture and told a story about a memorial that had been set up to someone who had been lost to gun violence. And something about moving away from the talking points, something about moving back into storytelling, and the addition of multimodal photography opened up something in students where the comments, the dialogue they were having immediately shifted to be more about questioning, to asking questions, curiosity, a sense of a sober sense that these are not simply issues that we debate in a classroom as an exercise. This is real life. These are people's experiences. And because they knew about these young people already, because they had already gone through an entire cycle of sharing about their lives, they cared about each other. And this led to an element of what I call critical civic empathy in a lot of my work, this idea that we're not simply saying you're another human being. It's saying, oh, I understand that I need to be really critically thinking about what does it mean in a country in which so many of us have very different lived experiences? How do we negotiate a way forward instead of battling, right? And we don't claim in the project to immediately drastically change anyone's political persuasions or any of their ideas. It's about kind of dropping the veil of political battle and leveraging digital media for, again, its most powerful potential contribution, which is connection and empathy. I can move to the next slide. These are some of the, again, quotes that young people shared with us about what it meant. And we won't go through word by word right now, but often like the very things that we were hoping to achieve are the things that students were finding. They were recognizing that people's lives could be different. They were recognizing that they could learn different cultures, different history. Katie's students in Washington had very different experiences than the students that were drawn from all over the country, from urban communities, suburban communities, very different racial demographics, like all different kinds of students. We consciously cultivated a community that could have lots of generative diversity. There's this idea of engaging with people in different points of view. And also that point about socializing. One of the most surprising things we found this year is just how important young people felt it was to just find connection. Like literally just talking to each other was a civic act because they often feel so isolated and so disconnected from others around the country. Next slide, please. And one thing I want to mention as well is that this is designed, obviously, and we care a lot about what young people are experiencing, but this is a really powerful experience for teachers too. And I mentioned before that we are a family. I wasn't quite recognizing when I came up with the idea to bring people together of, you know, what it would mean to get through a pandemic together as a teacher community, what it would mean to have a professional learning experience that in which we shared multimodal stories with each other, just as we asked young people to do. We all created our own who are we contributions. We see this as a way to continue our learning that goes far beyond a lot of the kind of training that we get about particular curricular materials or different kinds of policies. This was really like, what do we believe our profession can do to help build that just world that we dream of? And for one of our teachers, this was really a powerful experience early in her career to help her want to stay in the field of education. This idea that these are passionate teachers and we are simply a representation of what we know is out there. We are not special. We are teachers that are dealing with the same constraints as everyone else. And that teachers are very eager to develop their practice in the realm of civic learning and to incorporate their young people into a sense of community. And so those are things that we are all kind of thinking about as we move forward, as our political context continues to experience turbulence, as we continue to feel a lot of division and polarization, as we move into the next school year, which will be an election year. What does it mean when we know young people care about what's going on around them outside the classroom? How do we do that in a way that is generative, that does not proselytize to anyone, but that gives them the space to simply think about the civic future that they want to live in. And we couldn't have done that, obviously, without the support of NCTE, who's like appreciated this vision from the very beginning. So I'm going to turn it over to Executive Director Emily Kirkpatrick to talk a little bit about NCTE's role.
Thank you, Nicole and Katie. Let's advance to the next slide, please, and actually one further. Thank you. NCTE obviously believes in this work. We believe in it so much that we're out raising private philanthropic dollars to support it. There are some very concrete pedagogical and scholarly reasons that we believe in it. And in sharing the next few slides, we're also offering resources to everyone in the audience to learn from and draw from NCT's work directly, and links will be provided. As you might estimate, NCTE has defined what literacy means over time, and this is a definition that's deservedly and periodically updated. The current definition, which was last interrogated in the year 2019, so on the eve of the pandemic, discusses how to be literate in today's society, we must be able to build and sustain intentional global and cross-cultural connections and relationships. And that is indeed exactly what this program does for the students and the teachers that it connects with. So we're exemplifying what literacy means in this age. And you'll also notice an emphasis on solving problems collaboratively and strengthening independent thought, acknowledging that we're all at different intersections of perspectives and lived experiences. Let's advance to the next slide, please. Another resource that this program models is our belief of how media education plays a role in all of our lives, and very much a role in the instruction and learning of English language arts in the current era. We express in this important research-based statement that all learners, all students have the right, and therefore as educators, we have the responsibility to providing opportunities where students can explore questions relating to power and representation through critical reading, listening, and viewing. Using their voices through writing and speaking and self-expression in multiple genres and across formats, and again, making relevant connections between school and society through the use of digital media and popular culture. You can see how this program exemplifies that, again, research-based position as well as vision. Let's advance one step further, please. Parallel to NCTE's scholarly work that I've just shared with you, an independent group stemming from the National Education Academy came forward with a really important research call. And that call invites and instigates many disciplines to join the work of civics education in this urgent era. Led by Dr. Carol Lee, this work calls upon professional organizations such as NCTE and far beyond, certainly thinking about the museum, the library, communities, and beyond, to engage in dialogue both within and across organizations to consider how we contribute to civic learning, reasoning, and discourse across curriculum and lifespan. And again, when we met Nicole's vision, it was just a question of how far could we move and how many resources could we bring to the table to support this program and hopefully scale it over many years in the future. All three resources that I've shared with you either have been already shared in the chat line or will be very soon. Let's advance a step further, please. And as I hand it back over to Nicole and Katie, I leave you with the thought that what you're seeing today is a manifestation across geographies in this country of the very theme of this year's Smithsonian Summit. you're seeing how teachers and students are thriving at the intersections and creating so many more intersections, dialogue points, points for understanding as a learning community. And this gives me such great hope for our world, and hope that I think we all need. Back to you, Nicole and Katie.
Thank you so much, Emily. We're going to spend time, we're going to try to leave some time open for any questions that folks have. So please feel free to use the chat for any questions that you'd like to ask about any aspect of the program. But we wanted to offer, you know, as good teachers we are, we know that we want some concrete strategies that folks could bring with them from this presentation. And so we wanted to think about lessons we can gain from the 3D project that can apply to whatever educational space you're working in, whether it's a classroom, whether it's a museum education, informal education, wherever you are. We believe that we can apply some of these strategies that we've learned from several years of this kind of online dialogue. And the first one, I know we've kind of touched on a few times, but I think it's really important to really kind of speak about this idea of small moves being radical acts. There's this idea sometimes when we think about civic learning in these times, it feels so urgent, it feels so overwhelming and huge that we often feel like it's difficult to find a place to start. Or if we're not part of a large project that's already organized, how do we do this? Or if I'm living in a community where it feels difficult to talk about these issues, where do I go? And this idea that, again, that civic learning is not about simply immediately talking about controversial political issues. Civics is about bringing our full humanity together to figure out what it means to live in public in a world that is changing every day. So I know it's very difficult to see on the screen, but in one of our chat groups, as students started to talk to each other, this is simply about what young people want to talk about, right? Like we started, as we said, like opening up the gates to letting them talk to each other, trusting them to be able to talk to each other with curiosity and care. We'll talk a little bit about some strategies we use to foster those competencies. But when you give young people the chance to just say the things that they are interested in, they're interested in everything from, you know, music to also the idea of social media as a powerful form of connection, or they want to talk about how different we are in different parts of the world, or I want to talk about what we have in common, or I want to make connection over sports. And any little thing that seems like it's not civic that they want to talk about is actually the pathway into a civic conversation. So starting small, starting with their humanity, starting with letting them be teenagers, talking to other teenagers with the support of caring adults is the start of civic action. So figuring out ways that we can increase an audience that is not simply themselves is one of the things that digital media makes possible to us. So whether it's a Zoom meeting with you and teachers in your same school district that live in different neighborhoods, or in your same state, or the professional networks that you currently have, there are ways that simply talking to people outside of our teachers as the only audience for our work really, really engages students to think about a real world audience and real people they could be talking to, which is, I know, one of the things that Katie's students were really interested in. If we could move to the next slide. Katie, could you talk a little bit about, we kind of came up together as a group with these three questions about the gratitude, the bridge, and the question of how we could help young people to figure out how to talk to each other when they saw another student's post.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we had the students responding to each other, then we came up with these, you know, three things: gratitude, bridge, and question, to have them do, right? And that was like the format for their response. So, you know, we wanted them to start off with, you know, that gratitude piece, like something that they were thankful for their, for, you know, whoever they were responding to sharing, because, you know, that's like kind of that positive, you know, right? So that we start off, you know, with that positive, and then that second part, that bridge, either as something that was similar or something that was different, between, right, their lives and the group members' life, the introduction that they were looking at. And I think that was really, you know, the key, because, you know, that was kind of, I think initially a lot of students would say, there's nothing similar, you know, and then they would have to think about it a little bit, you know, and then go and be like, well, you know, actually it is similar, you know, that, you know, they're in the same grade as me, and, you know, that they like to listen to music and I like to listen to music, you know, something really small like that, can be, you know, kind of that bridge to make those connections, with each other. And then, question at the end, right, was, you know, what would you like to ask them further? You know, what would you like to know more about that they had shared? And I think that those questions really, you know, started some really interesting conversations. That was one of the, on my slides that I had shared, was one of my students had shared an art piece that he had created to introduce himself. And it was a hand-drawn piece, and he's an artist. And, you know, so several questions came in from kids from other schools asking, you know, what do all these pieces mean? You know, is there meaning behind just the actual image, you know? And then that spurred this very long conversation that they ended up having of, you know, all the parts and pieces and what they meant, what they mean, and why they were there. And I think that those questions, right, from the bridges, from those gratitudes, right, those questions that came out of it, were just really interesting. And that's something that you can replicate when, you know, if you're doing something, you know, similar, even across, I think, classrooms too, because if you're in, you know, in a district or in an urban setting that has, you know, different groups of students, I think that, you know, these similar things, when you're having dialogue with each other, really can, you know, support those, you know, those deeper critical thinking skills and those, you know, higher level questioning on making those connections.
Mhm. And the previous cohort also came up with this idea of the 4 C's. So, you know, again, you bring a group of teachers together, we're going to come up with great supports and strategies. And this gets back to our idea that young people may be talking to each other all the time on social media, but that doesn't mean that they are cultivating the skills that are involved in civic dialogue. They need our support for that. And that's something that we have expertise in as educators that we can support them with. But like we said, if young people are put into groups, they often are drawn toward this idea of political debate. But what would it mean if we instead reminded them to respond to other folks' posts with care, with a sense of connection, an ethic of community, and a vibe of curiosity? And so using that led to conversations in each of the different teachers' classrooms, so that when they came to those digital spaces, they were thinking critically about how they talk to each other. If we can move to the next slide, and then I see we've got a few questions that we can address in the next few minutes. As I mentioned at the start, our job as educators, we teach the youth, right? We teach young people for a world that we cannot yet imagine. There are things happening every day that are difficult to imagine. And so I often, and this is an image that comes from a book written with my colleague, a co-advisor, and a co-investigator on this project, Antero Garcia. The two of us wrote a book called Civics for the World to Come. And in that book, we argue that every teacher is a civics teacher. No matter what grade level, no matter what subject area, no matter what environment you teach in, you are a civics teacher. And that means that all of our job is to help young people to figure out what the world could be. We all want a world that is more compassionate and caring than the world that we're currently living in for our children, for our young people. And we could be doing that in everything that we do. And that doesn't mean that we have to throw out any of our existing curriculum. It just means that we need to orient all of our curriculum to how does it matter for the world that we hope young people will be living in? What skills do they need to live together in a world facing challenges that we cannot yet dream of? And so all of the work that we do in the 3D project and all of the work that teachers do in their classrooms, along with all of the standards that we need to meet, all of that, we know all the things that, and this again was oriented into the school day. So teachers were still doing their mandated curriculum, dealing with all of the different mandates of their school district, but doing so with a sense of how can I incorporate inquiry, imagination, advocacy, networking, and storytelling into some element of every unit that I do, with the sense of these two concentric circles that are around it. Number one, youth agency. We truly have to trust in the brilliance of our young people. They are developing civic agents. They do not turn into citizens when they turn 18. They are citizens now. They care about the same issues that we care about. They are curious and they want our support to talk through them. And this idea of equity and justice. If we want to live in a world in which all young people can thrive, we need to be thinking seriously about what it means to have these conversations in all of our classrooms. And let's move to the next slide. And I'm going to turn it back over to Katie to talk a little bit about the digital media piece.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, Nicole, you touched on this just a minute ago when we're talking about mandated curriculum and actually working in the classroom, that I think that teachers, we can remember, and administrators, we can support, right, the fact that digital media is literacy. And, you know, one story that I wanted to share, right, is that to teach my students how to do a comic strip before I required them, right, to do a comic strip potentially, right, for the introduction for this project. I had them do a synthesis project on ocean plastics, which again is a civic issue, right? This is, we're talking about the environment. And they had to synthesize sources, and they had to include those sources in this comic strip. And not only, right, were they creating the text that whatever their characters might be saying, but they were also creating the images, right, and the colors and what was highlighted and what was not shown, right, in the comic strip. And all of those parts and pieces, right, go together, right, to create that argument. But my students then, when they went to take our state test, and then afterwards, I had them reflect on, what were some of the parts and pieces this year that helped them the most, particularly for my students who passed the state testing. And I had multiple students, probably more than half of my students, who said that specific ocean plastics comic strip helped them pass the synthesis essay that's required by our state. That they pulled that up and they said that really helped them. Just that idea of actually, putting together multiple pieces of literacy, not just writing it down, but also visualizing it, right, and creating it, really helped them figure out how they wanted to attack that synthesis, standard that we have in our state. And so, I think that digital media really can be very powerful for creating literacy in the classroom.
And Katie, what you talked about actually relates to one of the questions. There's so many questions in the chat. I know we can't get to all of them, but I know there's a question here about how to integrate into state standards and assessment. And I think what Katie just discussed is kind of emblematic of what all the teachers did, is that, again, this wasn't a project that teachers did like one day a week and then we never talked about it again. Each teacher, again, they have their own state mandates, standards to deal with. And everyone found a way to kind of massage this into things that they were already doing. So essay assignments that were already happening, standards that had to be addressed. And we had to leave it up to we didn't mandate any one way to do that as a project. So we really see this as a collaborative where teachers, they would share strategies with each other. We were talking all the time. So folks, no matter what was going on in their classrooms, we learned a lot about each other's educational systems, honestly, as we were doing this as well, and which was really powerful. I know we only have a few more minutes, and I appreciate there's several questions here about whether we like other people that want to do this, and we love that, right? So obviously we want people to keep an eye on the NCTE space because we are continuing the project, and the idea of a toolkit is a great idea that someone asked about. So there's several ways that we're trying to express some of our findings from the project. We do have articles and blogs that have been published through NCTE that we can provide links to for folks. The book that my colleague and I wrote, we write a lot about strategies for the classroom that come from this work. You can read more stories about the 3D project in the book Civics for the World to Come. But also we do plan to continue the project, and we plan to continue the project not only with English teachers, but also I think writ large. I saw some questions about middle school. We do believe that it's possible to have this dialogue with young people at various ages. It obviously takes some scaffolding and we need to think differently, and that's what we want the ingenuity of teachers to do. All of this is possible, and we want folks that in your own practice, wherever you are, to be thinking about ways that you can to do this as well. There's a question here about NCTE working towards broadening access to this young population of middle schoolers and gearing them towards them so they can connect and diversify their worldview at a young age. I know, Emily, we've got divisions, obviously. There are elementary, this work is happening at the elementary section of NCTE, middle school section. All aspects of NCTE really have resources related to this work. Oh, no, Emily, if you wanted to talk a little bit about NCTE's role there.
I'm happy to briefly. The most important thing is I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletters and become part of NCTE if you aren't already. And this type of opportunity will pretty naturally flow your way. From time to time, we do solicit input and also interest and engagement. I think that's how we found you, Katie. And stay tuned. We are actively raising money for things like this. So become part of our ecosystem if you aren't already.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question in the chat. I know we only have about a minute left about how we came up with the 4 C's or even the gratitude bridge. And Katie, could you explain a little bit about like just the organic way that we come together on Zoom and just talk through like what we need for to move forward and then how we come up with it together through brainstorming?
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of starts with, well, how are we going to do this? And as a group, right, then we all have an opportunity to think about like, okay, well, what works for us as adults? And then how might we transfer that down, right, to a classroom? And when we all got together initially, I mean, we were in a similar position, right, as our students. We were all from different parts of the country. We all have different perspectives. We didn't know each other. So I think that thinking of starting there and then having those conversations. Well, what about this? This works for my kids. This works for, for this situation. And then I think that that's, really how, the creations happen. I know that we are probably just about out of time. I don't feel like I had time to really like fully answer that question.
Yeah, we're going to turn it back over to close this out, but I just want to encourage everyone to trust in your ability to be a civic educator and to start small with these conversations because your students are ready.
Thank you so much to Emily, Nicole, and Katie for that incredibly enlightening and engaging session. I know we found that very informative. And we thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the remainder of our Education Summit events. Thank you, everyone.